Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. and today I'm reviewing Micro Dojo, a game so small that I have this plastic bag where the entire thing fits into, and then this rulebook as the closest thing I have to a box. But Micro Dojo is an abstract tactical game with 2 players that is micro. I mean, this is what I have here. It's so small that we can't even get a good camera shot in of the game. But that said, Micro Dojo, like I said already, tactical, abstract game going back and forth as you take turns controlling the samurai on the board to go ahead and take an action with one and then move it to do the action of that spot. You're going to be going back and forth doing that action of moving the different samurais, although you have to choose a free samurai, a free character. So this blue character over here chooses that one, moves them there. The green one has to choose one of the 2 available characters, goes ahead, moves that there, grabs 2 coins. You're going back and forth trying to do the actions on the board, activating the available samurai, ultimately in order to, well, win. How do you win? Well, you want to be the first player to 7 points over here. 7 points on this track. You're going to use your marker to slowly move up the track as you go. And there's a few ways to get points. First of all, you can in general trade resources in for the game. You can take an action to trade resources in, 4 points. That's option 1. The primary way is likely going to be these objectives, though. At the top of the track, we have a bunch of objectives, and they are variable. A bunch of other ones in this bag over here. And they are both advanced and regular. There's an advanced mode to the game, which I'll explain briefly at the end. But you're going to be utilizing those objectives to try to achieve, well, the objective. And you'll get a variable number of points. 1 for the first 2, 2 for the second 2, and then 3 for the third. So in a game that goes to 7 points, getting that 3-point second objective, third objective, oh well, 5th objective technically, getting that 3-point 5th objective can be huge in a game that goes to 7 points. The objectives are a range of things from who controls the most buildings, these are buildings on the side, we haven't talked about them yet, to who controls more resources of a given type, to who controls less resources of a given type, things like that. You're trying to be mindful of hitting the objective at a certain point in time. Because the player who activates the objective is not inherently the player who cashes in on it, although usually it is because, usually, not always, you don't want to activate an objective that you're not actively winning. But sometimes there are reasons to, especially in the case of a tie, where no one gets the points. So you're trying to take actions to move the objective track along and try to slowly activate objective after objective, ideally when you are prepped for it, or when it's a tie, ensuring that your opponent cannot get what they want. And then from there, that's the primary way you're going to get points. The other ways, like I said already, are you're going to be able to trade in resources. Some of the buildings have inherent points. This castle and the statue over here, they have a cost in food and in coins, but once you buy them, you'll earn those points along the track. And then other objectives let you trade in resources for points. So you can trade in 3 rice for a point, 3 food for a point, which is a better ratio than you get from the default game state. So once again, you're trying to get points in the game, you're taking actions moving back and forth to take various resources, food, and coins. Then you have various actions. You have the building a building action, where you can build a building and possibly even get a discount on said building. You're trying to achieve the objectives, you're trying to build buildings that will give you better point conversion, as well as potentially actions, as well as potentially straight up points. Go back and forth, and whoever achieves their goal, whoever achieves 7 points first, is the winner of Micro Dojo. Now, the advanced mode comes with 2 main changes. First of all is they give you some advanced objectives, some more nuanced objectives that you want to be mindful of how to accomplish. And then secondly, they give you different movement abilities to the various characters, and they give it in a few different ways, so there are a few different options on the table as to how to utilize them. But if you want the characters to not all be the same and just be moving around the board, if you want them to have unique abilities on them as far as how they move, and again, it's shared players. Everyone else can use them, but if you want the characters to have a little bit more nuance or depth, there are advanced modes where you can utilize them there, and that ultimately is Micro Dojo. You can have variability in the various objectives you're going for, you can have variability in the buildings you're going for. There is a solo mode that I have not dived into, and that's what we have here. Which brings us to the review, starting off with ease of play. The rules are super easy to get through. I mean, this is the entire rule set, and half of that is like abilities and objectives and things like that. There's not a lot of information to go through here. This is a game you can pick up and learn in maybe 10 minutes, and you can teach it easily in 5. I mean, right about now, we should be roughly 5 minutes into this video, and I basically taught you everything you need to know, albeit not as good as it would be if it were in person. Table space, as you can see, is beyond minimal. This thing is tiny, absolutely tiny. This is not taking up any table space at all. This is the kind of thing that you can't play it on the palm of your hand, but you literally could pick up a book and play it on the book that you're holding in the palm of your hand. So close enough if you just happen to be carrying books around, which, why wouldn't you? They're books, they're fantastic. As far as game time can drag a bit for the game that it is. I've had games that last 7 to 10 minutes. I've also had games that last, well, sometimes probably aggressive. I've had games that last 15 minutes, but then I've had games that drag for around half an hour. Now, to be fair to the game, half an hour is what they say it should take, but this is a game that to me doesn't feel like it should be a half-hour game. When the games are 15 minutes, they felt like they were the right length. When the games were half an hour long, it felt too long for the level of depth and nuance that's being provided here. So this, to me, while they accurately rate it as half an hour, and I don't think I've had a game go longer than that, for me it feels longer than it should be at that time frame. And when I had the fast games at 15 minutes or so, that's when it feels about right. As far as player count, this is a 1 or 2 player game. It's a 2-player game with a solo mode. I have not played the solo mode, so I cannot comment on that. I've played this at 2 players, and inherently it's high interaction. You're going back and forth, trying to block each other, high interaction, head-to-head, 2-player game. As far as what I like, don't like, and can see others not liking. Starting off with what I like, the gameplay for the size is incredible. This is literally fits in here. This could be played on a book that's in the palm of your hand. The amount of gameplay you get here for the size is a lot. And the multiple pathways to gain points gives you enough of a room to breathe as far as the strategy, because without that, it would kind of be very linear in what it's doing. But the fact that you can try to be pursuing objectives, you can be pursuing buildings, you can be pursuing straight trading in of resources, although that's usually more relevant late game unless you have a building that lets you do so. But there are a variety of ways you can try to achieve your goals and to move the various characters around the board to achieve those goals, or to focus on blocking versus getting, which way you want to do it. So there are multiple pathways to both block and to pursue whatever you're trying to get in the game. And the advanced mode really opens up the movement. The extra objectives I didn't find overly complicated. I would have honestly included them from the get-go. I can see why they didn't, but I would have. The advanced movement, though, also, it's not that complicated. It's worth just diving through the rules, looking at the advanced movement, maybe getting in a game first just to get your feel for things, but then throw in the advanced movement. It's very simple, and it adds a lot more to the tactical aspect of how to move the characters around the board. As far as what I don't like, the abilities in general lack variety. And I mean that both in terms of the abilities, the objectives, and the characters. While there is some variety in terms of having multiple abilities, having multiple objectives, having multiple buildings, or having characters with different movement powers, for the most part, they seem to fall into the same parameters of have the most of this, have the most of that, have the least of this sometimes. There are 1 or 2 objectives that are slightly different, and then the buildings are the same thing. Most of them fall into some sort of category of getting points or getting more resources. Because the scope of the game is so small in what it's doing, there's not a lot of room for it to breathe. There's not a lot of room for it to explore or be interesting in terms of nuanced stuff. So it is very samey despite the variability. And then secondly, the game can devolve to a back and forth of perfect information plays. Now, this is usually more of a late game situation than an early game situation, and it's part of what can drag out that 15-minute game to be a 30-minute long one. But once you get to a certain point in the game where you're like, you have 5 points, I have 6 points, or whatever numbers you have, if I let you get that final objective, you're going to win. So now the only thing I need to do is stop you from getting that final objective. At that point, you start moving into perfect information back and forth, where each player tries to do the only optimal move that makes sense for them given their constraints. And at a certain point, it devolves simply into who can out perfect information the other person just based on where they started. Because there's not enough nuance in the game. The extra movement does that a little bit, but it's still the scope of what the game is doing is narrow enough that you can mostly see all those patterns. And so once you see that clear pathway of what the other person needs to do to win, it devolves to perfect information back and forth until one player manages to break that, and that can drag. It can take up half the game as you move into that lockstep with each other, dragging out the game to an endpoint. As far as what I can see others not liking, that final objective for 3 points can feel frustrating if the player behind wins. If you have a player with 6 points and a player with 4 points, and you're trying to get to 7, and that player with 4 points manages to break that final objective, especially if it's done after that lockstep back and forth, it can feel a bit anticlimactic. It can feel a bit like, okay, great, I played better, but you got the final objective, so fine. Now, it's not that much of a problem because players should be planning around that, but it is something that I can see being frustrating for the player who the player who was in the lead to lose by that margin because of the 3-point objective. That can be a big deal. I mean, that's half the points in the game in a single step, whereas everything else you did may have been a lot of work for not nearly as much reward. As far as final thoughts on Micro Dojo, Micro Dojo is a game that does a lot with very little. In terms of the cost to gameplay, there's a ton. In terms of the size to gameplay, there's a ton. But at the same time, I'm not someone who looks at the size of the game as a factor in what I do. This is very similar to the Tiny Epic Tactics series, which often deliver a lot of gameplay in a smaller box, but it's also rarely delivered what I'm looking for specifically, because I'm looking for gameplay without compromise. Now, that's obviously a factor for every different person. If you have a smaller table, if you have less shelf space, if you're trying to be conscious of spending, $8 on a game instead of $50 on a game. Those are all factors you have to take into account as far as picking the right game for you. For me, Micro Dojo feels like it is both impressive in what it's doing, and yet on gameplay alone, I find it to be okay. There's just not enough scope or scale in what it's doing for it to be a game that I'm going to pick up and pull off the shelf. Do I think it's a good game? Yes. Do I think it's incredibly notable with what they've done with the size and cost? Absolutely. Is this one I'm picking and choosing based on gameplay alone? No. It's a 3 out of 5 for me. It's a good game, but not one that stands out on its own if you ignore the cost to value, whatever the cost and size to gameplay ratio. As far as other game recommendations, I highly recommend Circle the Wagons, which I think does very much deliver on the cost and size to gameplay ratio. And then, of course, anything in the Tiny Epic series, but most specifically Tiny Epic Tactics, will have the most general similarity in the feel of this one. Until next time, I'm Alex Ratcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you found this helpful, and as always, have a good one.